Yo, what is up guys? Today, I'm going to be talking about all things VR4. As many of you may know by now, I recently purchased a year 2000 Mitsubishi Galant VR-4. There's not actually a lot of information floating around about this car, and that's largely due to the fact it wasn't delivered to many countries outside of Japan. Australia definitely didn't receive them, and the only way they were brought into this country was through import dealers or personal imports, which is why, you know, compared to any other Australian delivered car, their numbers are so few and there's such little information floating around. So today, I'm going to do my very best to shed a bit of light on what makes this elusive piece of Japanese muscle what it is. Now, in order to begin this tale, let's go all the way back to 1969 when Mitsubishi released its first variant of the Galant, the Mitsubishi Colt Galant. So in Australia, this car was released as the Chrysler Valiant Galant. Because Mitsubishi hadn't actually started distributing their cars in Australia back then. In America, it was known as the Dodge Colt. We basically then skip a few generations. We go through Gen 2, 3, 4, 5, before we finally arrive at Generation 6. And the reason I've skipped all those generations is purely because the VR4 variants began with Generation 6. Now, this car was introduced by Mitsubishi in order to comply with Group A rally homologation regulations. Now, for those of you that don't know what that is, let me briefly explain. In order to qualify for participation within the Group A rally class, manufacturers had to produce at least 2,500 units of the competing vehicle per 25,000 units of the model that it was based on. For example, Subaru would have had to produce 2,500 Impreza WRXs out of 25,000 stock base model Imprezas. So for the Mitsubishi, this meant they had to produce 2,500 VR4 variants out of their standard Galants. And that is how the VR4 was conceived. It was Mitsubishi's first attempt at entering the rally sphere and really making a name for themselves. The 6th generation Mitsubishi Galant VR4 sported the inline-4 2-litre turbocharged engine now known as the 4G63. This engine produced 177 kilowatts at the crank and 304 Newton meters of torque. The Galant VR4 went on to be very good at what it was made to do by Mitsubishi. It went on to earn 6 World Rally Championship titles between the years 1989 and 1992. So, you may be wondering, what happened to it if it was so successful? Many manufacturers realized that their WRC cars of the 80s were just too thick to handle the tight technical corners that the Group A rally stage had to offer. So what did they do? They made their cars smaller. So Subaru moved from the Legacy or Liberty platform, as it's known here in Australia, over to the Impreza, which was smaller. We had Ford moving from the Sierra Cosworth to the Escort. Toyota moved from the Celica to the Corolla. And finally, Mitsubishi took the engine and transmission from the Galant VR4 and dumped it in what is now known as the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution. This is actually why the 6th generation Galant VR4 is colloquially referred to as the Evo Zero, because it essentially is the granddaddy of all the Evos out there. So, Evo owners, remember your roots. The Evo ended up becoming Mitsubishi's hardcore flagship model, which was used to showcase the company's innovation, technology, and performance. This brings us to the Generation 7 Mitsubishi Galant VR4, which was no longer bound by any racing regulations or restrictions, and was no longer Mitsubishi's hardcore racing model. So because of this, they introduced a brand new engine, which was much smoother, a V6 twin-turbo 2-litre with the engine code 6A12TT. So this generation is really where the Galant distinguished itself from the Evo line. You can tell it's trying to fill that niche halfway between a hardcore sports car like the Evo or a really luxurious highway cruiser. This model was released as both a sedan or a liftback, which was known as the Mitsubishi Galant Sport GT. I think the liftback actually looks kind of cool. So this generation came in either a 5-speed manual or Mitsubishi's 4-speed Invex automatic system, which contained fuzzy logic and actually adapted to the driver's driving style and adapted to road conditions on the fly. So power and torque remained almost identical to the previous generation. However, I'd say that the delivery of this power and torque was drastically different given the addition of 2 cylinders and the migration from inline to a V configuration. Finally, we have arrived at the 8th generation of Mitsubishi Galant VR-4. This was the last major iteration of Galant VR-4 before Mitsubishi ceased production. So these were released from 1996 all the way through to 2002. With the 8th generation came a substantially increased engine capacity of 2.5 litres, which pushed power up all the way to 208 kilowatts and torque up to 369 newton meters. This is where it gets real meaty, boys, so pay attention. From the years 1996 to the end of 1997, we had what was known as the pre-facelift model. From 1998 onwards, we had the facelift models. Now I'm going to focus on the facelift models purely because it'll be easier that way and far less confusing, because there were so many little differences between the two and all the variants involved. Just quickly though, this is the pre-facelift model, this is the facelift model. I don't know about you guys, but I personally much rather the facelift. I think it looks more aggressive and far meatier. So as you can see, the front bar's pretty different, and it's actually got a bigger bulge in the bonnet, and in my opinion looks a lot more aggressive. The VR4 came out as a sedan known as the Galant and a wagon known as the Legnum. They were both split into 2 different trim levels, Type V being the base model and Type S being the highest trim level. So the Galant and the Legnum VR4 came with either a 5-speed manual or Mitsubishi's 5-speed automatic known as Invex 2, not to be confused with the original Invex found in the previous generation. Invex 2 was so much better than the first iteration of Invex. It was now an advanced, self-learning 5-speed automatic, which was based on Porsche's Tiptronic system. This was offered with both the Type V and Type S variants. The Type S also came with active yaw control, or AYC. This was first seen on the Evo 4, which allowed power to be sent independently to each of the rear wheels. This made the Galant or Legnum far more nimble than other cars of a similar size. The Type S also came with some fully sick fender flares, as pictured here. One thing to note is that Mitsubishi did not release any manual facelift Galants in a Type S trim level. So they were only released as Type Vs.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say.
Unfortunately, in 2002, Mitsubishi had to call it quits due to the lack of interest and the loss of financial viability, especially having both the Galant and the Evos being released simultaneously. And there you have it. In my opinion, one of the coolest, most unique and underrated cars to come out of Japan in the late 90s and early 2000s. A car many of you probably wouldn't have heard of before you saw it on my channel. And even if you had, you probably didn't know a lot about it. So I hope you all learned something today. In the next video, I'll talk about my specific car and do a little bit of a walk around, and I'll talk a bit more about why I wanted to buy it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. I will catch you on the next one.